All right, so in this video, we're continuing in the series where we're talking about negative numbers. We already discussed multiplication, we discussed division, now we're going to get into addition. And you will see when we talk about addition and subtraction, where the prior work on multiplication in particular would enter the picture. All right, so to illustrate addition using negative numbers, we're using the same $15 that we're using all the time. Right? 15 singles. I'm going to divide them into two sets. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. The first set is $9. The second set is $6. So we're using two separate sets of money, both of which we can see add up to $15. But again, we're going to inject some meaning and some context into the discussion to illustrate the operation of the negative sign. All right, using money, of course. So let me start with addition. Let us start with the situation where the both sets of money are what we refer to as positive. So in other words, I have $9 coming into me, I have $6 coming into me. Plus 9, plus 9. 9 and 6 is 15. We understand that intuitively. We are accustomed with that. And in reverse, if I have $6 coming in and I have $9 coming in, 6 plus 9 is also 15. So in other words, just as we had in the situation where we were multiplying earlier on, we have the situation when we add in, where the order doesn't enter the picture at all. The order doesn't make a difference. So we know that 9 plus 6 is equal to 15. We know that 6 plus 9 is also equal to 15. The order doesn't make a difference to the result. The order in which you interact the entities does not make a difference to the result. Remember the word for that. We said that the operation of addition is commutative. All right? All of these things are things that they had to keep in mind. We saw that multiplication was commutative. We see now that addition is also commutative. All right? 9 plus 6 is 15. 6 plus 9 is also 15. Good. All positive, straightforward and simple. Let us now get into the situation where we have negative numbers to contend with. And of course, because minus $9 is not something that we could physically count, right? You could count plus 9, you could count plus 6, right? You can't count minus $9 or minus $6. So in other words, once the negative sign enters the fray, it is because something is happening that we need to describe. Something is happening that we need to ascribe some kind of particular meaning or significance to. All right? So, let us start with the situation where we have plus 9 and minus 6. Right? So, if we have plus 9 and minus 6, let me say $9 coming into me, right? And with that $9, I now have to pay out $6. 3, 4, 5, 6. If I have to pay out $6 out of that 9 minus 6, we end up with 3. We are accustomed with that. 9 minus 6 is 3, right? Or 9 plus minus 6 is 3. So in other words, you have 9, and in the language of debt and finance, you take on a debt of, let me say, $6. So you have $9 in your hand, but let me say you take on a debt of $6, which means you have to pay out $6. Or, yeah, let me use it as that for now because I want to stick to the language of addition. So in other words, instead of simply saying we're taking away 6, which is what it will end up being, we use specific language and say that we're taking on debt, we add in a deficit, so to speak. We're getting real technical here now. We talk in finance, you will hear people talking like that in government circles, right? On the news and whatever. You're taking on debt. You're adding a deficit. That's what you're doing. So if you have $9 and you add a deficit of $6, it means that $6 leaving your coffers, right? $6 gone. So by adding, with the marker, by, watch it now, by adding a deficit of $6, what you end up with is a surplus of $3. You take $6 out, which effectively would be the same thing as saying that 9 minus 6 is equal to 3. So in other words, and this is where the reference to multiplication enters the picture now. In other words, plus by a minus will lead you with a minus. So we remember we went through that already, where we said that positive by negative is negative. So in other words, anytime you see the signs coming face to face in a written expression, that is multiplication. So if you understand it as multiplication, having already gone through what the different permutations of multiplication means, it can help you to just flow. So plus, negative, negative, boom, end of discussion. All right? And we could work it in the reverse. So let us say that you have $6 in your hand, right? But with that $6 in hand, for whatever reason, you now have to take on a debt or add a deficit of $9. So in other words, because it's money that you don't have in your hand, we could use the analogy of borrowing $9. So you have $6 in your hand. You borrow $9, which means that effectively you have a deficit of $3. Why? Because you had to pay back this $6. That $6 gone. And after you pay back this $6, you still have $3 missing. You still have $3 that you had to find to add to the $6 that you just paid back. So in other words, you're short of $3 even after you pay back. Let me say you pay back the $6 you had, you still have $3 that you had to find. Right? So that's the idea. Right? So again, because of the ubiquitous, nice word boy, because of the ubiquitous nature of money, we understand these things very quickly when we deal with money. But when we start to write on a board, we're having problems. So in other words, we don't even realize how frequently and how effectively and efficiently we actually do anything without understanding that that is what we're exactly doing. So you have $6. You take on a deficit of $9 by borrowing. Let me say you're borrowing $9, which means that you're still short of $3 at the end. We understand that. We know that. And chances are we would have experienced that at some point where you borrow some sum of money and you had to pay back. Right? Yeah, that's basically it. So in other words, we have a rule now where, and I'm going to write this in general terms now. You could say A plus minus B is the same thing as A minus B. That's basically what it is. Now, of course, if A is greater than B, then A minus B would be positive. So in other words, if A is greater than B, then that will be A minus B. And the answer will be positive. If B is greater than A, right? If B is greater than A, as in the case where we have A plus minus b, right? B is greater than a. Then you still have a minus b, but in this case, a minus b would be negative. What I'm trying to do in these videos is to give you a sense of how these things interact. And then with the questions of practice, you have the opportunity now to develop a rhythm, to develop a flow, to develop a sense of timing about the thing. So that when you see it, in any context in which you encounter it, you don't have to spend 5 or 10 minutes or however long trying to figure out what it really is, right? When you get to that point in dealing with negative numbers, then you're on the way to getting through with the algebra, because as we discussed before, a lot of the algebra will inevitably involve the use of negative numbers. All right, so we're going again. Let us say in this case that you're starting off with a debt of $9, a deficit of $9. Let me see, let me count here, boy. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So in other words, you have a deficit of $9. You had to pay that out. That $9 gone, right? But when you pay out the $9, $6 come back to you. Let me say the person give you back $6 or whatever it is, right? We're being simple here, but we're being simple so that you understand the flow, how the thing flowing. So $9 going out, debt. Or you pay for something or whatever it is. You pay back something or whatever it is. $9 gone. Whoosh. $6 come back. If $6 come back, let me stay in the frame. $9 gone. $6 come back. It means you still have $3 outside. This is your minus 3, right? So minus 9 plus 6 leave you at minus 3. All right? On the other hand, consider now the situation where you have a debt of $6. Right? So that will be minus 6. A very good example that I could use that most of us would be familiar with somewhat would be you have an account in the bank and you know they have these service charges, right? So sometimes you go in and you see a minus on your account, right? Or maybe it's a credit card and you know, well, all right, you have a particular payment of a particular amount and you see a minus. So in other words, or it might be a standing order, something that you're paying out. So the bank putting the thing there, you see a minus sign in front of it, it means that that money gone. Whenever that money come, it gone, right? So in other words, let us say you have a minus 6 on your account, be it a service charge or a late fee or a standing order or something. So in other words, you have an existing debt of $6, right? And then $9 come in, boom. So in other words, you have $6 scheduled to depart. You have $6 scheduled to depart, awaiting the arrival of the said $6. But instead, $9 come. So with 6 already scheduled to depart, when $9 come, guess what happened? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. $6 gone. Leaving now with $3 in your hand. You see? So we apply the negative sign there. Minus 6 plus 9 leave you with plus 3. We understand that. We went through that at some point, all of us. Right? Once you're dealing with money, at some point, you find yourself in a situation where you have money going out before it even reaches. And then a sum of money greater than the amount of money going out arise. And it leaves you with a little surplus at the end All right, so how are we going to write that down in written form? Let us say that the first one we had was minus 9 plus 6. Right, yes, I have a little thing there that I could refer to. Right? So he would have started off with a debt of $9 and he received $6. All right, so minus 9 plus 6, that's the first one. We agreed that that left us with minus 3. And then on the other hand, we had minus 6. And then we add 9 to that, and then it left us with plus 3. So in other words, minus 6 plus 9, and I'm changing the color now. Minus 6 plus 9 is the same thing as 9 plus 6, which we might be a little more familiar with. Excuse. We are quite familiar with this here. Big number minus small number. We left with a smaller number as a surplus. This here we're not so familiar with, where you have the minus, the negative number, plus a larger positive number to get a smaller surplus. And that is why I put the exercises to practice, because for those of us who still having difficulty dealing with this, sometimes what we really need might be to sit down and do 60 questions where you're going through the thing one question at a time. So in other words, you do as many questions as you need to do to catch it. That is the level of commitment that we're looking for. That is the level of desire that we're looking for. In other words, you're doing whatever it takes, you're taking as long as it takes, because you really want to understand this thing. And you're applying that mentality to basic stuff, simple stuff, which means that when you get onto the more complicated stuff, you apply the same mentality and the same work ethic, and you will find eventually that whatever your level of ability is, passing a maths exam would not even be a discussion. Right? As I would have mentioned before, not everybody will get a 1, not everybody will get an A, not everybody will get a distinction, not everybody will get a scholarship. But, geez man, everybody could pass an exam. It just means that you had to go through a particular process that might take different amounts of time for different people. Once you're willing to do it, it will get done. All right, so back to the maths now. So over here, minus 9 plus 6 is equal to minus 3. This is the same thing as 6 minus 9 being equal to minus 3. So both of these situations are situations where we mightn't be so familiar with it, right? But we had to get familiar with it. We are accustomed with 9 minus 6. We know this since we small, right? But now we have minus 6 plus 9. We ain't really realize that this is the same as that. That is what I want you to experience. So as soon as you see this, you could make the switch in your head and get this. Same story over here. You already know that 9 minus 6 is 3. So if you know that 9 minus 6 is 3, and you see 6 minus 9, you know immediately that 6 minus 9 cannot possibly be the same 3 as 9 minus 6. But if 9 minus 6 is plus 3, then 6 minus 9 is minus 3. Right? And when we have it written like this, you have it as minus 9 plus 6. So again, you want to get to the point where if you see this, and you have to deal with this, you can make the switch in your head and get this. All right? Because in both instances here, the line written in red is an easier thing to process. But we had to understand. And the reason why we could do this is because of the commutative nature of the addition operation. So in other words, whether we have minus 9 plus 6 or whether we have plus 6 minus 9 is the same thing, right? Because we add in. Because this is plus 6 plus minus 9, which is just 6 minus 9, right? Same story here. Minus 6 plus 9 is the same thing as plus 9 minus 6, which is the same thing as, I put it in green, plus 9 plus minus 6, right? This is the same thing as plus 6 plus minus 9. Alright? And again, because addition is commutative, you get the same minus 3 in both instances. So, I'm spending a lot of time talking and explaining and illustrating. And I trust that somewhere within all the talk, you start to understand certain things. If it is that this topic was a topic that he was having problems with. Notice my use of the past tense. Was. I'm saying that because that is what I want for you. That must be history. Past tense. You used to have problems with negative numbers, but not anymore. Whether my video was part of that process of getting out of that, or you went with somebody else, teacher, YouTube video, your friend, your neighbor, your family, whatever it is, the most important ingredient is practice. You need to practice as much as and as often as you need to get the thing done. Because when you start to get into the more complicated aspects of the algebra, this should be taken for granted. You don't want to be spending a whole lot of time trying to figure out when you have minus sign and plus signs and everything mixed up. Alright? Nice. So we're going again. Next set. So in the final permutation under addition, we're going to deal with addition when we have two negative numbers being added to each other. Alright? So suppose you have, two negative numbers being added to each other. So again, let we talk the thing. Let us say that, again, think about these things in terms of debt, in terms of your bank account, in terms of your credit card, in terms of whatever, right? Think of it in terms of your interaction, maybe with your trust, your credit, in the parlor, in the grocery. You borrow some money from a friend or whatever it is, right? Let us say you have a pre-existing debt of $9. $9 gone. And for some reason, you incur further debt. So in other words, you take on additional debt. Sound like a politician there, boy? You sound like an economist. You take on debt. You incur an additional deficit. Woo! Woo! Yeah, boy. Right? We sounding all fancy and dancy, right? What does that mean? Initial debt, $9. Additional debt, $6. Gone. $9 gone, $6 gone. We understand immediately, as a consequence of our life experience, that you now have a total debt of $15 gone. Yeah? So, initial debt of $9, you take on an additional debt of $6. We know from our life experience that that will end us up with a total debt of $15. We know that. That is common sense. That is life experience. That is street thing, you know. You know, a lot of us who don't want, for whatever reason, to go through the physical discipline of the school system. School is a bad thing. You ain't want to go to school. You ain't want to deal with no teacher. You ain't want to deal with no book. Right? So we talk about book sense and common sense. And somehow we feel that book sense is a bad thing and common sense is a good thing. Common sense is a good thing, but book sense is a good thing too. And I think we all know that. What happens is that we tend to pit the two of them against each other. So somehow we have this battle in our head about book sense versus common sense. Listen, there have no battle between book sense and common sense. Book sense and common sense are different expressions of the same sense. And the same time and effort that you have to take to get a certain level of book sense is the same time you have to take to acquire the common sense. You feel people just born with common sense? You feel common sense is just something you pick up at the snap of a finger? No. Common sense is something that you pick up over a period of time. Repeated action, repeated experience, you learn from your mistakes, you observe, you listen. Yeah? The same process by which you acquire common sense. That is the same process by which you acquire book sense. Right? So we had to stop this foolishness about book sense versus common sense. Both of them are equally useful and both of them are equally necessary. Right? Yeah. For those of us who think that book sense is not necessary, then what you're basically doing is living at the behest of the people who choose to acquire the book sense. And for those of us who think that common sense is not necessary, it's the same thing. You're living at the behest of the people who have that common sense, that life experience, that street experience. Both of them necessary and both of them help each other. So for those of us who we ain't past maths yet, and you have this negative dialogue going on in your head. I don't need maths. What are good for? I have common sense. Yeah, you have common sense, but the maths could enhance your common sense too. There are certain things about the maths that when you think about it and it enhances your thinking, it enhances your ability to perform in ways that you probably will only understand after you acquire the thing, after you get yourself to a point where you have the knowledge, right? So we encourage the knowledge, but we put it in the context of common sense, which is why I'm using money as a tool to explain the maths. All right? So let me do this in reverse now. Let us say we have a debt of $6. Again, let me use the language now. Let me use the jargon, the terminology. You have a debt of $6. 4, 5, 6. $6 gone. And then you incur further debt. You take on an additional deficit of $9. So $6 gone, $9 gone, equals $15 gone. Right? So same thing. $6 as deficit, you incur a further deficit of $9. We know immediately that the overall deficit is $15, or your debt of $15. Yeah? We know that. Yeah. That is common sense. That is life. That is also maths. As I tell my people all the time, maths is life and life is maths. Yeah? Boom. So to get to the point of expressing this in more mathematical terms, right? Minus 9 plus minus 6 plus minus 6 is the same thing as minus 9 minus 6, which will give you the minus 15. In other words, you have a negative and then you take on a negative, then what you actually have is an addition of the two negatives to give you even more negatives. Yeah? So this is one of the forms. Well, hold on. I'm jumping ahead of the game, man. That is subtraction thing we're dealing with. We ain't reached there yet. Alright, so let me take that out of the picture for now. Leave that alone. Check out the video on subtraction. You go see it. Right? That will happen when we reach here. You see when we reach here? Now we can say minus into 9 plus 6. And again, all of these rules are things that will be reinforced when you get into your factorization, because what we have actually done here is to take this expression and factorize it by taking out the minus 1 as a common factor, and we get something inside. But we leave that for another video. The point I'm making is that once you start getting yourself familiar with these things, it makes your journey a lot easier when you get deeper into the thing. Alright? Of course, in red here, that would be minus 15. Right. In the same vein, if we had the minus 6 plus minus 9, right? And I'm going to, because of the, now man, we can rub off the blue and take the top of the board, right? So I can rub off here. Right? Rub off there. We draw a line here. And we say minus 6 plus minus 9 is equal to minus 6 minus 9, which is equal to the same minus 15. Alright, and by the same logic, when you reach here, you have two positives, two negatives, one compounding on the other one, which you would have seen. You see it when I demonstrated using the money, and you feel it because you experienced that already. Right? One debt, and then you add another debt. We express it mathematically like this, which is the same thing as saying you add in the two, which will give you a final total. Right? Now, again, I wanted to see the multiplication showing up. Right? Look at here again. Plus minus to give you minus, plus minus to give you minus. That is why we started this series of videos with multiplication, because an awareness of the multiplication is what puts you in a better position to deal with the signs when they interact with each other on the addition and subtraction. All right? So, to generalize, to conclude the video, right? In general, and of course you saw that whether you had minus 9 plus minus 6, I'm going to write it on the board because I want everybody to see what we're really trying to say here, right? Whether you had minus 9 plus minus 6, or you had minus 6 plus minus 9, in both cases the answer was minus 15. So again, the commutative nature of the addition process comes to the fore, where it doesn't matter which one you put first and which one you put second. If you're adding, the answer is the same, even when negative signs are involved. So the commutative property does not depend on whether you're dealing with positive or negative numbers. To hold, commutative is commutative. Right, so we're going again. So to generalize, we can say that minus A plus minus B, is equal to minus A minus B, which is equal to minus into A plus B. We could also say that minus B plus minus A is equal to minus B minus A, which is equal to minus into B plus A. And we already established previously that A plus B is the same thing as B plus A via the property of commutativity, the commutative property. All right, so that basically brings us to the end of this section where we talk about the addition involving negative numbers. Yeah, so stay tuned. We have one more to go, which is the subtraction. One more as far as the basic operations are concerned. We have one or two other things to discuss after that, and that will be it as far as the entire playlist is concerned. So stay tuned.